Thank you.
Could I have a tablespoon?
Water, not in the salt.
That was off the coastline.
Thank you.
That's
I
what
will another cup, please.
I didn't know you wanted some. You'll get some more now. I suppose there is some more.
This is about a potter who went out to West Africa during the Second World War for what was supposed to be a 2-year assignment and stayed on for over 20 years. I was born in 1901. I did my training under Bernard Leach at St. Ives in Cornwall from 1923 until 1926. Bernard Leach had spent 10 years in Japan studying the techniques of Oriental stoneware pottery, and he had recently returned to Britain to introduce this new approach to the potter's art. At that time, I was chiefly interested in English country pottery, slipware. And after I left St. Ives, I concentrated on making this, first at Winchcombe in Gloucestershire and later at Wenford Bridge in Cornwall, where I still pot with the help of partners, friends and pupils. I began making stoneware pottery in West Africa, using the techniques I'd learned from Leach, because high-temperature stoneware was the thing they wanted there. This is about my life as a potter and a return visit which I made in 1973 to the places in West Africa where I used to work. When I was a little boy, I was in love with Mr. Fishley's pots at Fremington Pottery in North Devon. And then when I grew up and wanted to get that sort of pot again, I looked around and I found he'd been dead for 10 years. Well, by that time, I was 20 and I was halfway through a very difficult classics course at the University of Oxford. And so I was obliged to wait until I'd finished with that, because it really would have offended too many people if I had. Dropping out was not fashionable at that time. So I had to wait until I was through with that. And then by that time, I had very luckily become acquainted with Mr. Bernard Leach and Mr. Halliday. And I went down to St. Ives. I spent 3 years at St. Ives. And when my 3 years was up there, they were the really formative years for really knowing about what's what in pottery. Then I wanted to find a traditional slipware pottery somewhere in England where it either could be carried on or revived. And I had very little money, but I very luckily found Winchcombe pottery, or Greet pottery as it was called, in Gloucestershire. And then I rented that and started it up again and got a traditional potter back to work, and who was still around in the district. It had been dead for how many years? 12, I think, when I took it over and rented it, revived it, as it were. So I worked there for 13 years, and that's where I did a lot of all my early work. Got slightly known and also got married, which was quite important. When I was at Winchcombe, that was when the Great Depression arrived and dragged on and on. And all my left-wing friends began to say, why aren't you doing something socially relevant and useful to the masses? Well, the only thing a craftsman can do of that kind is to make designs for industrial production. So that's when I first went to Stoke-on-Trent. I went along to Mr. Hewitt's at Copeland and said, look at me. I've been making pottery for 15 or 20 years now, and I feel I ought to be making prototypes for mass production. In the 18th century, your designs used to come from working craftsmen. And that's why they were so good then. Whereas now, your designs are altogether divorced from any feeling of clay, and that's why they're so lousy. Mr. Hewitt just looked at me and said, Mr. Cardew, we get dozens of people like you every week. But they were very nice to me and let me work there for 5 or 6 weeks and make my prototypes, but of course only for my own amusement. It didn't really cut any ice with them. Soon after that, the Great Depression turned into World War II, and handmade pottery suddenly seemed to be meaningless or totally irrelevant, and I became more and more frustrated. So when an amazing opportunity suddenly offered itself to go out to Achimota College in Ghana, I jumped at the chance, even though it meant leaving Mariel and our 3 boys behind. By the time I actually sailed, it was mid-1942, and the submarine warfare was at its worst. We were a convoy of 40 or 50 ships, and the voyage out took nearly 6 weeks. If we were torpedoed, we all knew there was no chance of survival, but all I could think was, thank God to be going somewhere where I shall be really needed, and where my talents, such as they are, can be employed usefully. There was a lady called Mrs. Hayes, who'd been on the ship all those 35 or 38 days. And all that time, she and I never exchanged a single word. Nobody introduced her. She apparently had heard that I was doing pottery. And so I had a conversation with her on the very last day, and she wants to know about this pottery project and what relation it has to the native African tradition, and whether it is to be for the Africans' benefit or for our benefit only. Of course, I think it's for the Africans' benefit. But I didn't then fully realize that though it may be made to look so, and they might employ someone like me who is naive enough to think so, but really, at heart, it's for white man's benefit, though containing a large element of ministering to a thought that it should be for Africans' benefit. In any case, I can see now that it was a paternalistic exercise like most of the other so-called better activities of a colonial power. Well, when we'd had this little talk, she turned to me quite casually and said, "Have you done much pottery yourself, Mr. Cardew?"
This is one of a series of films about Africa and shows something of the way of life of the people of the Gold Coast. Pottery making is one of the oldest crafts known to mankind. In Africa, this ancient craft has been practiced for thousands of years. Now, as a result of experiments made at Achimota College, this government training center has been set up at Alajo in the Gold Coast colony to bring to Africans some of the skill and methods developed by potters in other countries. Here is the European instructor expert, anxiously waiting to see the outcome of the first batch.
That was during the war, you see. It was a war effort thing, and we were trying to build an enormous great place and get enormous buildings and kilns built. They said, "Can you make 181,000 pieces of tableware a year?" And I said, "Well, give them the throwers, of course we can." They said, "There's plenty of money, with plenty of buildings, you can make it." And then on top of that, they said, "Right, well, then we also want 200,000 latex cups for the rubber industry. We also want an unspecified number of salt glazed drain pipes and an unspecified number of electric insulators," all of which I kept on saying yes to, because I was full of enthusiasm for the idea. Well, anyway, almost every day, a lot of people used to come out from Accra looking for work at this new pottery and tile works. And among them was this man, Kofi Atty, and that's how we first met. It was 1942, and he is one of the few who stuck to pottery through thick and thin ever since. If it hadn't been for Kofi, I would perhaps have gone home again at the end of the war. And if it hadn't been for him, I would never have gone back to Nigeria 5 years later. Kofi practically is Africa for me. Was it Africa that taught me to be human, or did I get it from Kofi? So by the time the war came to an end, the authorities said, "Well, look at this great thing we tried to build. It's not been a great success. It, in fact, has been a total failure. You've delivered about perhaps a tenth of what you said you were going to be able to deliver. That doesn't seem to be suitable. Close it down. Close the whole thing down." Well, at that point, I'd so often said to Kofi and many others that after the war's over, we're going to stop all this nonsense and do it properly on a village scale. And then I found there was something that you could write in what were called representations. And that's to say, a sort of protest against what they had decided to do. They decided to do it anyway. I wrote in my representations and I said, look, this was done entirely the wrong way from the beginning, but because of the war, I suppose they had to do it the wrong way. They always told me at the Colonial Office in London that when the war was over, then they really wanted me to do the thing the proper way. And now I was being fobbed off with being told, well, you know, really, Mr. Cardew came at his own suggestion, as if that was a crime. So I ended up this wildly eloquent document of indignation saying, but however, I thought I felt confident that I should be able to find means, other means, to be useful to the potters of West Africa. Well, when this Alagio pottery collapsed and was closed, I gathered together the people who I thought were the hard workers and my friends, 2 or 3 people, chiefly Kofi, and we went out to this village called Vume Dugame, on the banks of the River Volta, little place about 70 miles to the east of Accra. Vume is a pottery village. Most of the women here make the traditional pottery, which is simply the soft-fired, unglazed ware which is made all over West Africa. Here I built a kiln for firing high-temperature glazed stoneware and put in machines for grinding the materials for the glazes. My object being to prove that glazed pottery could be successfully introduced as a new industry side by side with the traditional ware. The village is on the main road between Accra and Lagos. And anyone going along this road today can still recognize this building as some kind of a pottery. Looking at this ruin, one might say it's a monument of total failure. But I prefer to say it's a monument of the kind of foundations you've got to lay down if you're going to achieve anything in West Africa. Vume pottery was the long, hard apprenticeship I had to serve, which made it possible for me later on in Nigeria to build the Abuja pottery and make a success of it. There's a wonderful passage in Mencius, the Chinese philosopher. When heaven has some important task in store for a man, it first exercises his mind with suffering and his sinews and bones with toil. It exposes his body to hunger and subjects him to extreme poverty. It confounds his undertakings. By all these methods, it stimulates his mind, hardens his nature, and supplies his incompetencies. Well, after 3 years of working at Vume, you see, I got into a very bad state of health. That was the worst side of it, and I had to go home because the money had come to an end, and I was always falling sick. And it wasn't until nearly 2 years later that I reappeared in West Africa. Very luckily, I saw an advertisement in the Times, I think it was, saying they wanted a potter to develop pottery in Nigeria. And that's how I went back. And that's how it came about that unheard of event, Africa gave me a second chance. If you want to travel anywhere in Nigeria, even today, the usual way is by truck. And for that, you have to go to a wonderful place called the Lorry Park. Once you've made terms with the owner, you've still got to find your lorry. And even then, you don't really know whether you've got a seat or not. If you're lucky, you can buy a seat in front beside the driver. If not, you have to travel on top.
Yanzu daga nan in kuka je mil 20 za ka fita.
Then there's an interminable wait. You don't know when you're really going to leave, but you daren't leave your truck or your seat for a minute. Eventually you get underway, usually anything from 2 to 8 hours later than you expected. In the years that followed World War II, the colonial government began to interest itself in the idea of developing the traditional crafts of the country into modern local industries. So in 1950, they sent me all over Nigeria looking for a place to start a pottery which would make high-temperature ware. I think their idea in my case was that I'd only got to wave a wand, as it were, and this stupid old native pottery would transform itself overnight into a modern tableware industry. But I knew from my previous experience in Ghana that this was nothing but an idle pipe dream. So I had to tell the government that the traditional pottery could not be improved upon. I was rather afraid they'd tell me to go home again. But they didn't. They promoted me instead and sent me to Abuja to start a pottery training center. Pottery Training Center, Abuja. The Emir of Abuja, who was the big chief in all that part of the country, was enthusiastic about the scheme, and he gave us a huge open site beside the river. The first thing we built was a small test kiln for trying out the materials. The local clays seemed to be promising, and I was also very keen to produce some glazed ware, even if only a token quantity, in order to get the people interested. At this time, I also began to teach myself Hausa, the main language of northern Nigeria. I started with about 6 trainees, but the demand for Abuja pottery has grown tremendously since I left 8 years ago, and now there are about 20 potters here. A lot of the pots are sold to visiting Europeans and Americans who come specially to Abuja to get them. But Abuja pots are also much sought after by the new Nigerians, who I fancy often prefer them to the imported tableware simply because they are made in Nigeria. Some people still ask me questions like, why should Nigerians want teacups? Well, of course, the answer to that one is, why should you want teacups? Tea drinking is almost as popular in Nigeria as it is anywhere else. Years ago, I pointed out to the Department of Commerce and Industries in Lagos that pots made in this way might not be able to compete with imported, mass-produced tablewares. But luckily for me, they were enlightened enough to say, but a modern Nigeria must have its own pottery industry. Well, a few years ago, when I left Abuja for the last time, all this space was occupied by a beautiful group of old buildings. And people said to me, when you get back, you're not going to like it. You're going to find that all your pretty old buildings have been torn down, including the first kiln. They've all been torn down, and in its place you'll find a great modern building. Well, now I now see the beginnings of this modern building, and I think it's a great thing for congratulation and not an occasion for tears at all, because those old buildings were extremely picturesque, and they made a very pretty picture, but they were temporary buildings, and they have done their work. They were the sort of buildings we could get built at that time. They were traditional Habe Hausa, Abuja buildings, and it was very important at that stage, when it was a new thing, that people coming in from the villages to work here, that they should come here and feel that really that they were at home, and that this newfangled pottery was not some ghastly new package deal that had been imported ready-made from Europe. It was something that was going to grow out of the soil itself. It's become a matter of pride in the northwest state of Nigeria, Abuja pottery, and it must have buildings that are in keeping with the status and prestige of this place that it has today. It's a matter of great congratulation all round. Ladi Kwali was the first of the women potters who came to work with me. It was lucky we found her. She helped to integrate the new industry with the traditional pottery. She was born in the village of Kwali, about 30 miles from Abuja, and was brought up as a potter from childhood.
And then Michael Cardew said he wanted to work with Ladi Kwali because she's a good potter. And then the emir had to go to her parents and begged. They didn't want to release her to come to work. But later the emir convinced them, the emir of Abuja convinced them, and they allowed her to come to Abuja. Well, when she came to Abuja, Mr. Cardew taught her how to use wheels. Originally, their work in their hometown, pot making by hands.
The Kwali potters pound the sticky clay and mix it 50-50 with coarse grit, so that the finished pots will be able to stand heat shocks. They can even be used for boiling water over a wood fire. Here they make the pots entirely by what they call building, ginin tukunya in the Hausa language. There's a terrific skill here, handed down from mother to daughter, or rather from auntie to niece, because they told me if a mother taught her daughter, there'd be too many quarrels in the family circle. This is going to be a very large pot. She pulls the clay up by hand and smooths it as she goes along and adds coils later on. In a context like this, any European advice would be completely out of place and unnecessary, because for really big pots like this, there's no special advantage in using a potter's wheel. In history, when the potter's wheel was first invented, it resulted in the women handing pottery making over to the men. In the traditional Nigerian society, even today, making pots is a part of the wife's duty, just as bread making used to be in a farmer's household in Europe. But when a machine comes into it, making pots becomes a whole-time job for the men, like bakers work in modern Europe. Where are all the men? They're probably out hunting, because this is dry season, or in the rainy season they'll be out farming. They don't use a potter's wheel, but visitors from abroad are always impressed. They can hardly believe that these pots were not made on a wheel, because they get such beautiful symmetry into their work and give it such a perfect finish. They do a good deal more decorating in Kwale than they do in many of the Nigerian traditions. Here she's drawing a conventionalized lizard. I don't know what it means. Maybe it's a magic creature which defends the contents of the pot. We might be tempted to call their way of firing primitive, but it isn't nearly as simple as it looks. First, they carefully preheat the dry pots over glowing embers to 100 centigrade or over, so that all traces of colloidally held or hygroscopic moisture are driven out. If they didn't do this, they would never be able to fire them the way they do, because this residual moisture would suddenly turn into gas and make the pots explode. The preheated pots are then taken out and carefully placed upside down on a bed of brushwood, and then they build a sort of bonfire round them. The firing takes only 1.5 hours. It always amazes me even so that the pots don't crack. I should need at least 48 hours to fire pots like these up to stoneware temperature. Look what she's doing now. This is a special liquor which they call makuba, a decoction of locust bean pods stewed in water. This will seal the pores and make the pot stronger. It also gives it a handsome mahogany brown finish. The pots are used for carrying and storing water, for storing grain and cooking, for palm wine, corn, beer, and many other uses. Pots like these, with variations in style from one area to another, are made all over Nigeria. And there's still a healthy demand for them. Nigeria is a fast-developing country, but the village people haven't given up using pots yet. This is the museum at Jos in northern Nigeria, which has the best collection of traditional pots in the country. There's a whole garden and gallery devoted to them. That's a very good example of the absolute necessity of handling pots in art galleries and museums and places. You see, you pick it up, it immediately begins to tell you all sorts of things you don't get just by looking at it. One is that it's got a handle here which absolutely fits your thumb. Big hand, I admit. This is an Igbo palm wine pot. Well, this is the sort of thing I was looking for. My problem was that there's all this
amazing material all over the country. And there's this terrific talent all over the country. And my job was to make modern tableware in Nigeria. And what sort of stuff was I going to make? Obviously, how are you going to tap and make use of this amazing talent? Because, you see, the technique of the local pottery is all unglazed, soft-fired earthenware, which cannot be used for tableware. So I used to look at all the pots and think, now, is there a teapot in that, or is there a casserole in that, or something like that? Of course, there are casseroles that you can translate directly. This, I thought, was a teapot. It wouldn't do for tea because you couldn't hold a hot teapot like that. But it's got all sorts of points that are good for a teapot, the little spout there, and if you gave it a handle and a small lid. So I found that the type of thing you could use in a modern industry, but not to copy. I wouldn't dream of imitating it directly. That's a terrible mistake. You can't turn that sort of thing on like a tap.
Adaptation, not imitation, is the thing. My approach is as a practicing craftsman, not as an anthropologist or a collector of exotica. Here's Peter at Abuja. His casseroles are recognizably descended from the traditional ones, but this is a wheel-thrown pot which is going to be glazed at high temperature. It's a new and quite different technique. He's following the logic of this new technique, not copying or imitating. And yet the Nigerian character and sense of form comes out irresistibly in everything he makes. One reason we took a long time to get Abuja started was having to find the right sort of clay, because to make high temperature pottery, just any sort of clay won't do. There was this tin mining industry up on the Jos Plateau. The open cast tin mines had exposed sedimentary kaolins of all sorts. Incidentally, it took one into the most fantastically beautiful places. All the glaze materials had to be local too. This was a matter of, you might say it was a fad with me, but it was a matter of principle, and I'm sure it paid off in the end. Because if you're starting a pottery in Nigeria, it's very tempting to say, well, why don't you import some nice glazes ready-made from Stoke-on-Trent? And it sounds so easy. But as a matter of fact, that has the objection that the whole exercise becomes a sort of package deal brought out from Europe and is not so likely to appeal profoundly to the people who are doing the work. Of course, we had to import some machines. This is the ball mill, a key piece of equipment, without which we shouldn't have been able to grind the materials for the glazes, feldspars, limestones and quartz sands, and wood ash slag from the kiln. For decoration, the pots are dipped in what we call slips. This is red slip, which turns black after firing. It's a 50-50 mix of local clay and laterite rock. The laterite rock has to be ground too in the ball mill. The design is scratched through. The potters seem to like this technique as much as I do myself. It's called sgraffito, or scratching. I love it because it's a simple and primitive and direct way of drawing. It's also quite closely related to the way they decorate the traditional pots. White slip is made from kaolin and feldspar. Now he's covering the slip with glaze. After firing, you'll be able to see the decoration as a white or pale green inlay on the dark body of the pot. Potters call this process setting the kiln. It looks boring, but it requires great skill and experience. Otherwise, the pots would go out of shape or get stuck together. Each plate has to sit inside its own container. which potters call a sagger. 1 sagger to 1 plate. Saggers are still used at Abuja. They used to be a familiar part of the industrial scene in the days when they still use solid fuel, which of course is the case here still. This kiln was built about 3 or 4 years ago by Michael O'Brien, who took over from me when I left in 1965. Its performance is very impressive. He designed ducts or channels to preheat the air, and the result is this kiln, though it's got double the capacity of the old one, fires much more quickly and only takes about 21 hours instead of 36. And of course, it's much more economical on fuel. Funny thing, I really find finding some terrible bore. I'd sit here and put up with it. Potters are 2 kinds. There's the mud and water potters who like making pots and messing about with clay, and there's the potters who love to fire kilns. And I'm personally a mud and water man, and I only do the kiln out of sort of sense of duty, you know. There came a stage when whenever I came down in the middle of the night to see how the fire was getting on, invariably the word always got around that if I came down, something would be sure to go wrong. So when I'd been there about 10 years or 12 years, if I showed my face even at the night time of the firing, they'd say, "Oh, keep away. Something's sure to go wrong if you come." Something did go wrong sometimes. You see, sometimes at the beginning people used to have a tendency to go to sleep between the hours of 12 midnight and 7 a.m. dawn. There's an awful hour, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, when really sleep gets like that and very difficult. So all I used to do was, at the time of the changing of the shift, it was about 11 p.m., I would come down by great effort, leave the house, come down in the night, and carrying 2 great bags of sweets, and I'd hand these over to Danjuma and say, "Kalmagan Darchi," you see, behold the cure for sleep. And then I would say, I'm not going to say it, no, I'm going away, goodbye. And I would all fast asleep, perfectly happy. And the firings always worked perfectly well. Luna massa one token I'm explaining about this color. because there was some American came here yesterday, and I told him everything on these pots is locally produced, and all the raw materials come from local country. And he said, in that case, what's the origin of that blue? Is that blue also local? And I said, of course it's local. It's an optical blue. It comes from that stuff over there. It's wood ash slag, which we get from the ash beds every time we fire the kiln.
Well, when they first saw glaze, it was wonderful, really. Pieces of stone broken up to powder, ashes added up together, and then it became glaze. They have never seen such a thing, and they never thought such a thing could be made.
I wonder why Abuja was successful and the other two things previous to that in Ghana were not. People often ask me, Al-Larja was far too big and far too paternalistic. That's the one at Achimota. I was terribly committed and wrapped up in it, and I was absolutely broken-hearted when it came to an end. And that was probably the most important single thing that happened. Then, in despair, so to speak, over that, I started up at this little village in Ghana called Vumi, and that was a terrible struggle. And that also I felt very, very possessive about. By the time I got to Abuja, I had learned a good deal more sense, and I'd also acquired a bit more knowledge, and chiefly more sense that when I was at Abuja, all the work I did there, I felt completely committed to what I was doing. And absolutely, I had my heart in it, but I did not feel possessive. And by the time I got here, both technically and also in the relationship of a white man to West Africa, I had learned a tremendous lot. I mean, I'm sure that the real reason why Abuja went well was that I was supremely happy at Abuja. I was having a gorgeous time. I was able to make a lot of nice pots. I was being paid into the bargain by a long-suffering government. I was having a beautiful time hunting out all the raw materials for the bodies and the fabrics and the glazes. And I was really enjoying life in a way that I don't think I'd ever enjoyed life before. I think it was a case of the Ewe or Togolese proverb, if you like yourself, people will like you.
This is something being picked up in what please to call the garden here. The garden, the so-called garden here is full of old bits of broken pot. This seems to be a bit of a cup and saucer that I made in the early Abuja days. And it was made by me, I can see. But it's funny because it reminds me of when I was at Vumi and having a very bad time in 1946. And we had a few pots coming out from the kiln. Mostly they were no good. The few that were any good were I was selling them to a man called Kwesi at Joseph Kwesi at Defley Ferry. And he was complaining of them that they were much too expensive and that they were the wrong color or something like that. And of course everything was going, I was having a very bad time. And when you're having a very bad time like that, you've just got to believe in your absolute star. You know, you've got to believe in your success. And so, in order to boost your own morale. So I sort of waggled my finger and shook my fist at him and I said, do you realize, Mr. Kwesi, that in 20 years' time people will be coming from America and England and all over the world hunting around in your backyard for even broken pieces, and they'll be glad to get them. Lies, 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 of course, because that was 1946, and now by 1966 and probably 76 when it comes, I don't suppose anybody will be rummaging round in Mr. Kwesi's backyard, if it still exists, looking for pots. But the point was that it was true for me at the time. It was poetically true, even though it wasn't really true. Somebody once said, go to Europe to learn about the past, to America to see the present, to Africa if you want to listen to the future. It would be wrong to think of Nigeria as a nation of villagers. Every time I go back there, the scene has changed, and I can hardly recognize it. All about Cranham and those places in the Cotswolds.
Sorry. Thanks.
I just can't face it. I'm sure it's very good.
I didn't like it.
You tried it, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
It's very idyllic. What's that, the pie?
No,
Cider with Rosie.
I bought full cider with Rosie.
Okay. There's
I've
an
never
amazing
had that.
sort of dreamy quality about the whole thing. Just impression of
Cider
endless
with Rosie,
sunny
was that?
days. And
I'm surprised that it works, this thing, but it does.
Oh, it works
It's meant for...
what ware is that?
Oh, this is Galena. This is slipware.
Crikey.
Made it winch. Quite all right. That's very respectful. It made at Winchcombe about 1938, I should think, or 37, 35. Good Lord, what have you got there? That I haven't seen for a long time. Made at Abuja about 1959. Made by me, I regret to say. It's lovely colours, isn't it? That's what we used to call a guari casserole. Maybe to call it that was a bit presumptuous and far-fetched, but there was a most beautiful guari casserole that had 3 of these little handles, and it had one of these things all the way around, which is known as a guru, meaning a belt. And it had lid, but of course the lid was always that way up.
It's a very dramatic shape, isn't it?
Well, it is. This is dramatic. I think it did dramatic things to me. I think it stimulated me a lot, this casserole, because it made me think, my God, that could be a most wonderful soup tureen. This guari shape, you see, and then I started making a totally new kind of soup tureen that I'd never made before, which more or less finished off like that. It's quite a difficult shape to make. What I took the law into my own hands and put this domed lid on, because I love complicated shapes that end with a domed lid, because it's a very exciting shape. But my job was to make something inspired by a guari casserole. My God, look at that, yes. Well, take this away. Don't let anybody look at this ever again, because this is absolutely magnificent. The decoration, everything about it, absolutely wonderful. You've got 2 there.
Yes.
Yeah, well, separate. That's it.
And there's the lid for this one.
That's right. That's a sort of more, this is what you might call a more European style of casserole. That's to say, more in line with European appetites and capacities and style of living. Of course, this definitely belongs to the extended family, I think you might say. Not say distended family. You see, that's what's so subtle. Who taught them to be so wonderful? I mean, something must have taught them. How are they so... I mean, we can't touch that sort of thing. I mean, it's so rich and so severe. If I was talking to a Ghanaian or a Nigerian today, I would say, however much you hate the memory of the colonial era, so that even to think of colonialism and colonialists pains you intolerably. Of course, it's an insulting relationship. Yet you'll possibly feel able to concede that here and there, purely on a personal level, there were cases when something positive happened. I don't know if one could call it creative. Something constructive, anyhow. Not anything so phony as promoting understanding between races. Something much more like simple friendship between individuals. Cases where a man was able to make use of the system to get something which the system itself didn't even aim at and didn't consciously intend. There must have been hundreds of cases of this kind, about which history says nothing, but sometimes the results are still visible. They've become a part of the West African scene and are still valued by West African people even today. Naturally, I'm tempted to think my experience in that small town, Abuja, was one of these. And I have to keep on reminding myself how very fortunate I was.